Before I get started, I want to thank JimLad800 for the Quake 3 footage. The URL at the bottom is his YouTube channel. So I'm going to take a look at 3 first-person shooters I used to play on the Sega Dreamcast: Quake 3, Unreal Tournament, and Outrigger. And the first game I'm going to touch on is Quake 3. So this port of Quake 3 doesn't look as good as the PC version, but it's pretty close. Looking at the graphics, as soon as you start the game you're going to notice it has a much nicer presentation in the menus than the PC version did. Not a big deal, but it's nice to look at. And of course, when it comes to graphics during gameplay, it looks great. It's actually better than I thought the Dreamcast was capable of at the time. Now, a major reason a lot of us flocked to the Dreamcast port is because we just did not have fast enough PCs to handle this game. So for a much cheaper price, we got an experience that was quite identical. If you're a real fan of the PC version, you're going to notice that the levels have been shrunk down a bit and use less polygons for detail. The texture quality is not quite as sharp, and some details have been removed from the levels. The game also uses a polygon compression technique, so some 3D models in the distance will have less detail when you are away from them, and they will quickly switch to more detailed models as you get closer. This change is rather subtle, but it doesn't take a trained eye to notice. These are small things that are going to bug PC enthusiasts, but it still looks great nevertheless. And this was also the best looking first-person shooter we saw on a console at the time. The game also maintains a very solid frame rate, but you'll notice the game gets a little laggy in the large space levels. And by the way, a little change made in the space levels is when you fall off the level, you don't die. You go through some sort of portal and teleport back to the stage. It's a nice touch instead of exploding from falling into oblivion. Unfortunately, this port did get rid of some of the larger levels, but my personal favorites did make it over. And a great new addition to the Dreamcast port is new music. It's mostly heavy rock music that's really fitting with the game. Here's a sample from one of my favorite tracks. Moving on, using a control works very well in this game as Quake didn't use too many buttons. And this game also supports both the Dreamcast keyboard and mouse, so you can play it just like on the PC. The multiplayer features really shine in this port, as you can play 4-player split screen. Unfortunately though, the more split screens you have limits the levels you can choose from. This was also an early game to actually feature online play. So Quake 3 on the Dreamcast ain't a perfect port, but it's still great. And it also brought a few additions like new levels and split-screen gameplay. I give Quake 3 for the Dreamcast a B. It's definitely a standout title in the library. Now I'm going to look at Unreal Tournament, which is a game I definitely wanted to play for the online feature. Like Quake 3, this is a faithful port of the PC game, and this review is going to touch on how it compares to the PC version more so than the gameplay. Visually, in regards to the levels, character models, and textures, it's very true to the original. However, during the time of its release, it wasn't exactly the most impressive looking game. Even for Dreamcast standards, it's not that great. But still, the graphics do look good, and they more than just get the job done. But in my opinion, here's the thing. This isn't exactly a high-end PC game. You can play it on a low-end Pentium 2 with no 3D accelerator, and still get a better experience than you will in the Dreamcast version. First of all, this port suffers from slowdown issues. Not only does slowdown occur in large open areas, but it also happens when multiple characters are shooting on the same screen at once, which happens pretty often. And the annoying thing about these slowdowns is it makes the game choppy. And for what the Dreamcast is capable of, and considering the graphics aren't very impressive, this really shouldn't be a problem. It wasn't this big of a problem on Quake 3 at least. When it comes to levels, I don't believe any were removed, and there are actually levels exclusive to this port. However, Assault Mode was removed completely. The engine developed for this port just does not handle large levels very well. Another thing is, it's weird that some levels will allow you to have 8 players running around, while some will only allow you to have 4. I'm sure this is because some levels take more resources, but you wouldn't think these characters take so much. Now, a great thing about this game, like in Quake 3, it supports 4-player split-screen gameplay. But just like in Quake 3, depending on how many split screens you have, limits what levels you can choose from. And I personally think you can only play on the best levels using 1 or 2 player mode. But to be fair, you still have a good amount of levels to choose from in 4 player mode. Using a control on this game works well for the most part. The only problem is using secondary fire. You have to tap up on the D-pad to use secondary fire, but I use the joystick to look around, so I basically have to switch from the joystick to the D-pad, which ruins my aim. And of course, if you own the Dreamcast keyboard and mouse, you can use them in this game as well. And like I said at the beginning, one of the main reasons I got this game was just to go online, which I love doing. That's how I spend a majority of my time playing this game. And of course, playing the offline campaign is a lot of fun as well. I spent hours on that. So this review might have came off a little negative, but like I said in the beginning, I was basically just going to compare it to the PC version. When it comes down to the sheer gameplay alone, it's Unreal Tournament. It's a great fucking game. But even as I play it, it just feels a little bit sloppy. Perhaps if this game had been put into the hands of developers who knew how to better utilize the Dreamcast, or at least made a bigger effort, I'd enjoy it a little more. Either way, this is an excellent game. I give Unreal Tournament for the Dreamcast a B, and it's a great alternative if you just don't have the PC version available. Lastly, I'm going to look at Outrigger, which was released in the arcades in 1999 and hit the Sega Dreamcast in 2001. This is one of the few times I bought a game without knowing a damn thing about it. All I knew is it was a first-person shooter, it was made by Sega, and it had online play. For some reason, that's all I needed to hear to shell out $50. But even with all those great things going for it, I was left pretty disappointed. Now, since this is an arcade game, I don't expect the depth of Quake 3 and Unreal Tournament, but this game is just way too simplified. And just so you guys know, they did make arcades of Redneck Rampage and Quake 1. So that shows arcade first-person shooters don't have to be this simple. And if you're going to keep them this simple on the arcades, at least expand on them a little bit when you bring them to a console. So the level design in this game is just terrible. The levels are ridiculously small, and for the most part they're just open areas. A lot of times you could just stand there and take enemies out. One of the fun things about first-person shooters is exploring levels, looking for weapons, and searching for your enemy. And when I say this game has small levels, I'd say the biggest stage in this game is 1/4 the size of the smallest stage in Quake 3. The only thing that makes these levels seem a little bigger is platforms. Yet when you get on a platform, you can't look too far down or up to take out enemies. So it's easy to nitpick this game for what it's not, but that doesn't mean it's not entertaining at all. The gameplay itself feels like a fast-paced version of Quake 3, so the game itself plays fine and the control is very responsive. The graphics are pretty impressive, but nothing amazing. It looks a lot like House of the Dead 2. So let me explain the game. When you select any mode, you can choose from several characters. There are 4 main characters, and each start with 3 weapons: a machine gun, grenades, and a bazooka. Between the 3 weapons, the bazooka is easily the best choice. There are also weapons lying around like a plasma rifle and a flamethrower. And as far as characters go, there's also unlockable characters and a character edit mode. In the character edit mode, you can either have the male or female version of the character you're seeing playing right now. You can change their color and select what weapons you want them to have. And that's really it, not a whole lot of depth. And now I'm going to explain the modes this game has to offer. In arcade mode, your goal is to kill a certain amount of people in a given amount of time. And every time you kill someone, a clock will pop up and that'll give you more time. There are 3 skill levels in arcade mode, and I finished them all in less than an hour. Another single player mode is mission mode. This essentially has random objectives. There are 45 missions to do, and of course they become more difficult as you go on. There are also unlockables that become available for completing missions, such as levels, characters, and weapons. And like I mentioned earlier, the game offers multiplayer modes, which include 4-player split screen and online play. However, I'm sure all the servers are down for online play. And given the poor design of the levels and the simplicity of the gameplay, it's just not a fun game to play with friends or even online. So that's really all there is to Outrigger. And I know this game wasn't intended to compete with Unreal Tournament and Quake 3, but it's just not a very solid game, period. So this game has a pretty nice feel, it's fairly unique, and it has some charm to it. And perhaps if the game was geared towards playing more like a traditional first-person shooter, it could be really fun. So I'm gonna go ahead and give this game a C, but it's a low C, it's almost a D. And I'm only gonna recommend this game to fans of arcade-style action. So that was 3 first-person shooters I used to play on the Sega Dreamcast. Quake 3 was great, Unreal Tournament was great, Outrigger, mediocre at best. But the game I would have really loved to see on the Sega Dreamcast, Half-Life. Unfortunately, this one got cancelled. Half-Life and Shenmue 2 were going to be the last big releases on the Sega Dreamcast, and both got cancelled. And at least Shenmue 2 came out in Europe. We got totally fucked when it came to Half-Life. But I do have a beta release of Half-Life. Maybe I'll give that game a shot and tell you guys my thoughts. But until next time, you guys take it easy.